Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I fully agree with Adam. There are four major trends which can be seen as drivers for the future of work. It's globalization, it's demographics, it's the environment, and of course it's digitalization. And my presentation will focus on a specific or more concrete issue, the potential impact of digitalization on employment forms. Now, what are my starting points and what are the questions of the presentation? First of all, in many countries, the composition of employment forms has become more heterogeneous. That means employment forms such as part-time employment or temporary employment gained in importance. Then, of course, studies have identified various drivers of changes in employment forms, such as institutions or changes in behavior. The question is, the question of this paper is, can digitalization be seen as a new driver in this respect? And more precise, which particular changes might be expected from digitalization in terms of risks, in terms of challenges, and also in terms of opportunities. The presentation will not give precise answers. Instead, it will discuss possible scenarios and important mechanisms which are of relevance. I would now like to start with the heterogeneity of employment. There are at least two major types of employment. One is self-employment and the other is dependent employment. And then there are certain features of employment which can vary a lot, like contractual stability, like remuneration, like the place of work, or the length and schedule of working hours. Now, usually, there are two main categories which define forms of employment, major categories. One is the so-called standard employment, and the other one is the so-called non-standard employment. Standard employment usually defines an unlimited work contract on a full-time basis, excluding agency work. This type of employment has usually a strong protection, for example, through a coverage by Social Security and collective agreements. On the other hand, we have non-standard employment, and this covers fixed-term contracts, agency work, part-time work, or one-person businesses. There's one thing which is important. One cannot really say that standard employment can be used synonymously with good or decent work, or the other way around, non-standard employment must not be bad employment. Why is that? Of course, standard employment can imply, for example, low hourly wages or even working poor. On the other hand, non-standard employment may be a stepping stone towards more stable employment. So one has to be very careful if one tries to, well, to evaluate or to value these types of employment. Now let's move to the possible changes in employment forms. Well, what are we talking about when we talk about changes in employment forms? First of all, there can of course be shifts between forms. That means shares can vary over time. Then, of course, there can be new forms which can arise. Then we may have changes within forms. For example, the issue of self-employment can, of course, be changed over time. And then there might be also changes referring to all forms of employment. Now, first of all, I would like to look at some figures for the European Union. And what I do here is I'm just looking at the labor force participation and then to have a closer look at types of employment. And here these types are distinguished. As I already mentioned, we have standard employment, we have non-standard employment, we have self-employment, and the gray area is not unemployed. That means inactive. And what we see here is, if we look at the European Union as a whole, that we had this increase in labor force participation, and at the same time, we also had an increase in standard employment. That means that the increase of non-standard employment was at the expense of inactivity. This is a very important issue. But if we look at certain countries, we do see that developments may differ. For example, we see that the overall European trend is, for example, can be seen also in the UK, in Germany, in Poland, or in Spain, where we do have also other countries where standard employment has decreased, for example, like Italy or Denmark. So that means development may differ across countries. Now, what is behind these changes? There are, at least from the literature, 4 issues which need to be mentioned. First of all, the structure of employment is, of course, important. Why is that? Because certain forms of employment are associated with certain characteristics, with certain segments of the labor market. For example, industries and socioeconomic characteristics may change over time, and this may have an impact on the composition of employment forms. Second issue is the institutional framework, labor law, social security, the public infrastructure may favor or disfavor certain forms of employment. Then, of course, preferences of firms and individuals. That means personal policies can change over time. The same is, for example, the role of employment during the life course is also an issue. And what is also of importance is market power. That means the labor market position of firms and individuals, which can, of course, change over time due to the employment situation, or which may also differ regarding certain segments of the labor market. And what is, of course, and this is the question of the paper, what's about digitization? And is there a new driver in this respect? Now, there are, in my point of view, 2 implications of digitalization. I do not want to go into details what is digitalization. I think we had several contributions which made this clear. On the one hand, we have this kind of indirect implications. Why indirect? Because the level and the composition of employment as a whole may change, wages may change, also matching may change, and this may have an indirect impact on employment forms. On the other hand, there are direct implications, and they have to do with internal flexibility or external flexibility. What do I mean with internal flexibility? Especially the hours of work, the locations of work. Some people talk about in this context as agile work. And then, of course, there is external flexibility, and here we have platform work and online work as a new challenge, as a new risk, or even as a new opportunity. Now, let's move first of all to the indirect implications. And I think, and I think other speakers have already mentioned this, that massive job losses or a massive technological unemployment is rather unlikely. And this has to do with compensating effects, which we have also seen in the past, product innovations, induced price reductions. I do not want to go into the details. But what is really very likely and very similar to what Adam said regarding the transition to an environment policy is structural change. And there are at least 3 areas. One is more employment in non-routine jobs and tasks, which favor creative and social services. Second one is less automatable occupations, which are usually now done by females, by women, so there might be this kind of an impact. And then high skill requirements, mainly at the expense of medium-term skills and partly of low skills. What is, in my point of view, the biggest risk and really a very large risk is a mismatch implying labor shortages and persistent unemployment. So it means the risk how structural change can be solved at the end of the day, because we expect higher job requirements as well as skill obsolescences. And also online job search may increase market transparency and allocation. This is also an indirect implication. Now, what we do know is from shift share analysis that how potential changes may influence employment forms, and what we know, or what I mentioned just earlier, is that what are changes caused by digitalization? As I mentioned, the rise in skill levels, the increasing female employment, and the growing share of service jobs. What we do know from this shift share analysis is that they are more or less, they do not play a major role, but at least regarding part-time employment, the increase in female employment and also the growing share of service jobs will, or we expect that they make a difference. Now let's move to the more direct effects, which might also be more important. And as I already mentioned, this is agile work. And what are the challenges? First of all, work is less dependent of space and time. That means these blurred boundaries. The measuring of work hours may become more difficult in the future, and this has to do with this agile work, and may even lose in importance. Might be likely that more output instead of input measurement is rather likely. What is also an issue is that preferences regarding working hours can contradict each other even more than in the past, because it offers so much opportunities for individuals on the one hand and for workers on the other hand. So that means to reconcile flexible staffing on the one hand and also work and family life on the other hand could even get more difficult, because digitalization offers so much opportunities for both sides of the market. Okay, we have got some data on mobile work across the European Union, and what we learn is that this is the spread is really big. We have countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Netherlands where these types of work are used rather frequently. On the other hand, we have countries like Italy, Greece, or the Czech Republic where the opposite is the case. Germany is somewhere in the back part of the distribution. And I have got some more information on Germany, which may explain why Germany has not such a high share of mobile work at the moment. On the one hand, what you have to know is that if we, for example, ask companies, we see that work from home is mostly used in big companies. So big companies offer much more in this respect than small companies. Then what do we also know? Work from home is more likely in the case of executives. It is more likely in the case of services and administrative jobs. It is also more likely if there is a pressure of time, if there is a high autonomy of workers, and if we deal with employment of parents. Workers also occasionally work from home. They work longer hours than workers not working from home. This is also a very interesting finding we got from some surveys. What are the advantages which are seen by workers on the one hand and a business on the other hand? For workers, for the business as such, they see a lot of advantages, for example, to be a more attractive employment, because they now can offer flexibility for employees. They also then offer opportunities to reconcile family and working life. Even the reduced driving time is an issue. And what is interesting, if you ask employees, they also see these kind of advantages. So we have a kind of a match of preferences of companies and works, and therefore you have a lot of opportunities in this respect. The same is true if we look at reasons against home office. So what is mentioned by businesses or employers and employees? The most important issue which is mentioned is that it is incompatible with the job. Sometimes you have got jobs, of course, where you couldn't do the work at home, for example. Think about personal social services and things like that. And the same is also reported by employees. Now, let's move to my final part, and this is dealing with digitalization and the forms of employment regarding the platform economy. Now, to understand what's going on here is what are platforms doing? First of all, they are a kind of a virtual market which distributes work assignments via crowdsourcing. And the advantage is, the economic advantage is that they reduce information costs and that they facilitate market-based transactions more appealing. Who knows, maybe there are people who know the theory of a firm. The firm is trying to reduce transaction costs. And here we have now a new mechanism which also reduce transaction costs, which were usually done by firms. So there might be a shift concerning this new possibility of allocation regarding jobs and workers. Platforms are not employers as such. It's very important. I'm not a labor lawyer, but labor lawyer, I think they will agree, because they only act as a virtual market. They bring together the both sides of the market, the demand and the supply, and also they assign business risks to market participants. So that is what they do. And what we also know is that they are especially suitable for business areas with a high service share and low capital investment demands. And what is also of interest, they provide an access to an ad hoc available labor reserve to workers all over the world, because platforms are not a national kind of phenomenon, they are an international kind of phenomenon. Okay. If we look at the data, and there's a lot of data also by the ILO, by the way, they also have a survey. I just used here the online labor index, which is provided by the University of Oxford. And what we do see is here, it's just a short period of time since July 2016 until January 2018, that there is definitely an increase, which is shown by this index. So we have an issue which is at the moment rather small, but there are many issues which are at the beginning rather small, but can, of course, increase over time. Now, what are the leading occupations of online work? And here I just have just illustrated some of them. For example, software, creative kind of work, clerical work, writing work, sales, or other professional kind of services. Some of these occupations require a considerable level of skills. Others are rather simple, such as, for example, picture editing. These are these kind of click workers. So there's a broad spectrum of skills involved in this type of work. If we look at the demand for online work, we also realize that most of the demand came from the Western world. That means the United States, especially also the European countries. On the other hand, the supply for online work is much more widespread. So you have much more supply workers from all parts of the world. And some of these jobs can also done by workers with low skills, as I already mentioned. Now, I would like to offer you some information concerning Germany regarding platform work. We distinguish online works in two categories. One is offline work, online work. What does this mean? Here, the platforms organize a virtual marketplace. The work as such is not done on the computer. So the work is just allocated. For example, if you look at crafts or cleaning services whatsoever, you just use the platform in order to have a certain job, and this is allocated to a certain person. But the work as such is not done on the computer. Whereas the online work is just done on the computer. Like click work, for example, as I already mentioned, picture editing or something like that. And what we do see is if we if we rely on our surveys, the share of online workers is still very, very low. But these are workers in Germany who were asked whether they are involved in this type of work. There can, of course, be workers in other parts of the world who do work for German companies, for German households and things like that. So one has to bear in mind that online work creates a global competition. So who is involved if we look at these small shares in Germany? So who are the persons who do this kind of work? We do see more men than women. We do see more younger people, as well as we educated people who are overrepresented. And what is also of interest, up to now, most online work is done as a secondary job with a rather low level of activity. So there are not many people really for whom online work is their major source of income. And what we also see, we just did a survey that the motives of individuals indicate new needs of workers, which is, in my point of view really very interesting. Just in order to let you know what is the motive of workers. Just to let you know, the most reported motive is I can decide when and where I am working, something which is rather strange or not something which is mentioned very often if we look at regular workers, that this is a preference. Or I can choose my work on my own, like self-employed, also I think would agree. And then also working is a good activity in times of leisure. So this may explain that this is a secondary job. So what we have here is that this type of employment also creates new opportunities and creates also an option to match new preferences. On the other hand, of course, you have all the other issues. For example, that I am reliant on the money. And issues that you have, of course, make your living, that's for sure. But what I would like to say is that there are certain opportunities and also certain risks involved in these new types of employment. And this brings me to my conclusions. I think that there is really still an urgent need for more empirical research on new types of employment, and also changes in certain characteristics of employment. We do need microdata. I think we also do need international comparisons for that. I'm very glad that the ILO is involved in this respect also. Then, of course, we also would need new definitions. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the term standard work and how we define standard work seems to be outdated. There is a need for new concepts. For example, dealing with more flexible working hours, maybe even more flexible locations of work, and also regarding new types of self-employment, which are sometimes really also voluntary. And then, of course, an issue is definitely the design of proper regulations for online work. And there, of course, you can think about state regulations, but also you may think about self-regulations. And there are now movement initiatives, and we have to take into account opportunities and limits of self-regulation and, of course, regulation. And then there is something which is also very important if we, for example, look at platform workers, and this is the issue of social security, of self-employed who are not necessarily involved in social security, at least in Germany and maybe in many other countries too. And think we have to discuss in this respect more incentives for voluntary types of insurance, or even implementing compulsory insurance. A colleague of mine, Enzo Weber, he, for example, proposed a digital social security. That means that would then be an obligation for platforms to pay social security contributions to national authorities, which would also, of course, be something which one can discuss in this respect. So that was my presentation. I thank you very much for the attention.